Welcome to my channel. Today we're diving into a mysterious story about the book Pika-1-2-Boo. It's a tale full of unexpected twists that might make you rethink what seems harmless. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on our future videos. Also, leave a comment and let us know where you're listening from. Is it a quiet place or somewhere special? Join us and see how this story lingers in your mind. Your child shouldn't ever read Pika-1-2-Boo. My name's Josiah, and I'm the single father of a 2-year-old boy named Robbie, named after his mother, Roberta. I hope Robbie feels some sort of connection, when he's older, to the mother he never met, never will meet, thanks to the obstetrician who failed to perform that emergency C-section in a timely manner. The last 2 years have trialed and taxed my soul to bankruptcy. I'm deep in the red now, with nothing but pain left to pay my debts. Yet this past week has been the most nightmarish, more nightmarish even, than seeing my own wife's body on that icy steel examination table. On Monday, Carl and Mary came over. They visit most evenings, actually. I teasingly call it their date night. Anyway, they gifted a children's story titled Pika-1-2-Boo, He Who Shows for Supper. It was a broad, hardy book with paperboard pages. On its cover, against a white backdrop, was a picture of a woman with one hand covering her right eye. She wore a sprawling and unseemly smile, wily too, as if she were privy to some awful secret, a secret specifically about me. Anyway, my eyes were drawn to small black letters beneath her disembodied head and hand. Pika-1. And beside her was a man, grinning even more atrociously, with hands covering both eyes. Naturally then, he was labeled Pika-2. However, there was no Pika-Boo. Given the name of the book, I had expected that to be the natural conclusion. Mary found this whilst cleaning out her grandfather's attic, Carl explained. I said you might want it for Robbie. I didn't, but Carl was a good friend and a sensitive soul. It would have hurt his feelings for me to reject the present. Screw me for being a people pleaser. And I know that sounds ungrateful, but it's hard to articulate what unnerved me. I just didn't like the look of the book, all frayed around the edges and ridden with mold from an attic untouched for years. Most of all, I didn't like what Mary had squealed before her husband passed the book to me. I used to love this story as a child. Would have kept reading it forever if Grandpa hadn't hidden it from me. What an odd thing to say, I thought. Only, it wasn't odd. It was, in some unexplained way, downright terrifying. I sent my 2 closest friends home around 6 in the evening, as I wanted to put Robbie to bed, also wanted to be alone. I love the heck out of Carl and Mary, but they fuss and fuss. Fuss until my head pounds, and I reflexively reach for Mr. Merlot, my dearest friend of all. Anyhow, just before bedtime, I started reading Pika-1-2-Boo to a giggling Robbie as he squirmed in my lap. The 8-paged book told the tale of a bizarre man named He Who Shows for Supper. He shows when you need him, shows for supper, and rest Pika-1, Pika-2, Pika-1-2-Boo. On page 1, there was a home's front hallway with an open door looking onto blackness. Blackness beyond night. It felt, to my eyes, painful, more than a printing error. Something was there, worming through the dark. And should you not feed him, he'll be far from his best Pika-1, Pika-2, Pika-1-2-Boo. On page 2, there wasn't a dining table, but a bathroom. Hardly the right setting for crockery and dining utensils. A blue floral shower curtain was drawn across the bath. A drape open only a tad at the side of the tub, but the gap was wide enough to reveal a head-shaped shadow on the tiled wall, the head of something sitting in the bath. At least it looked like a head, presumably belonging to the visitor, he who shows for supper. But I wasn't convinced by that, and I didn't like the image at all. Didn't like any of it. So set out the china, and a tall glass of red Pika-1, Pika-2, Pika-1-2-Boo. On page 3, a set of manly hands cradled an empty wine glass and a white plate of some brown, indiscernible dish, like an artist's unfinished afterthought or a haunting thing that the publisher had decided to censor. I leant towards the latter. But that unsettled me, so I tried to convince myself it had been either a misprint or an ink smudge from decades of damp. The bath must be running for the bump on his head Pika-1, Pika-2, Pika-1-2-Boo. On page 4, through the lulling shower curtain, the bathroom light cast a silhouette of what still seemed to be a head. Unlike the third page, however, it had sprouted a large lump. Just turn both your eyeballs and keep his growth low. Pika 1, Pika 2, Pika 1-2 Boo. On page 5, the bathwater was overflowing, running over the upper rim of the tub in streaks of a murky brown, ink that I hoped, like the blurry meal on the third page, to be an unintended discoloration of some sort. And once his head's level, he should get up and go. On page 6, there was an image staring down the barrel of the upstairs hallway, directly to the bathroom's open door. And within that tall frame was only blackness, much like that very first image. Oh, believe me, I wanted to stop reading, but I didn't. Couldn't, perhaps. But if not, then, oh no. On page 7, there was only white text against a black page. Pika 1, Pika 2, Pika 1-2 Boo. And in reverse, on page 8, there was only black text against white. Well, that was haunting, Robbie, I said as the boy sucked his thumb and contentedly eyed me. Thanks, Mary, for sharing your childhood trauma with us. Peekaboo. Pikachu, Robbie said, tittering away gleefully in my lap. Nearly, I laughed. Boy, do I wish we were watching Pokemon. Boo! My son loudly responded, making me jump, making himself chuckle more noisily. Are you proud of yourself for that? I asked, stifling a laugh. I'm glad one of us enjoyed it. Bed, Robbie yawned, mashing his eyes with tiny, balled-up fists. Is it bedtime for me? I teased. Or for Pika-you? Pika 1-2 Boo, hissed a voice small, childlike, but false. Instinctively, my fearful eyes shot down to Robbie. Mid-yawn, the boy dozily eyed his race car bed. Now it could have been him who whispered those 5 horrid words in quick succession, but it wasn't. Robbie rarely strings more than a pair of words together. He occasionally stretches to 3 words, and perhaps even 4, but not 5. And not those 5. Certainly not in such a clear, eloquent manner, and not in such a hushed whisper. I blamed it on sleep deprivation like everything else. Everything that happened to me, and everything I made happen. Then I put both the book and Robbie to bed. I don't remember what I ate or watched on the television from there onwards. My life has been a series of motions for a long time. I live so that Robbie lives. I blinked, then it was Tuesday. I invited Carl and Mary over, and they didn't need to be asked twice. It's a rarity for me to reach out. Of course, they weren't expecting to be apprehended. This isn't a children's book, I said, waving Pika 1-2 Boo in their faces before they'd even taken off their coats. It's a horror story about a stranger eating supper in the bath. Mary raised an eyebrow, eyed her husband, then she laughed. I don't know what you read last night, but it wasn't Pika 1-2 Boo. What? I asked. She smirked, then replied. Grandpa read that book to me every single day. I remember the story. It's about a picnic on a train. I answered by thrusting the book into my friend's hands, and she rolled her eyes before skimming through the pages. But her face quickly whitened. What? She whispered. Josiah, this isn't... I don't understand. This must be, I don't know, some other book in the Pika 1-2 Boo series? Well, you tell me, I said. You gave it to me. This haunting thing. You sound just like Grandpa, Mary smirked. He hated it too. I even caught him throwing the book out once. It ended up right back in the living room, though. Gosh, you should have seen the look on his face when it showed up, like he'd seen a ghost. Something deeply unnerved me about that anecdote, and I was so focused on Mary that I didn't even realize Carl had the book in his hands. He shows when you need him, he read. For some... But before my friend made it any farther, he was interrupted by knocking on the front door. Something that made Mary and Carl chuckle. And part of me, the part that still believes in some way that monsters live under my bed, expected to see a man at the door. But it was the pizza delivery boy, standing in the rain and frowning as thick, murky water poured off the lip of the awning onto his face. It was, strangely, muddying his face, and he quickly shoved the boxes into my hands before scurrying away. Well, obviously, I thought my home's exterior might need a clean. However, when I stepped off the porch to take a look, I was also muddied by rain from the very sky above. Water just as filthy as that trickling off the edge of my awning. Brown paste marring my skin. And strangely, As I looked out at the neighborhood beyond my property line, the rain looked clearer, as if some dirty cloud were hanging only above my house. "Josiah," Carl called from the other end of the hallway. "The pizza's getting wet." "And so are you," Mary added. "Right, yeah, you too," he chuckled. "You look filthy, mate. Get inside." Wednesday was a quiet day. I noticed the hollow wine rack in the kitchen, which incensed me to send a scathing group message to my two friends. I told them never to steal from me again. Then I tossed the phone onto the sofa. Instead, I narrated Pika 1-2 Boo to Robbie, as I needed a distraction from the throb in my skull. The withdrawal symptoms, I suppose. I don't have a problem. I'm just grieving. Anyway, when I got to the 4th page of the book, Robbie's chortling voice vanished. "Bed now?" Robbie interrupted coldly. I smiled. "Too scary? We're nearly there, Robbie. My son's tiny hand fell atop mine like a pet's paw and stopped me from turning the page. Then he gave me a looked at me with adult eyes. I don't know how else to explain it. There was a sense of knowing in them. A 2-year-old's eyes should be shallow, too shiny and new to have experienced anything, to have been weathered. But Robbie's eyes had seen something. That was the story they told. "No!" he shouted. We both had an early night. On Thursday, I was entirely stunned when Robbie wanted to hear the story again. "Really?" I asked, laughing. "Last night you really didn't want—" "Book," he cried. "I'm fine with that," I said calmingly. "But what do we say first?" "Please," Robbie replied. I nodded and began to read. He shows when you need him. Shows for supper and rest. Like Carl, I was interrupted, but there came no knock on the door this time. What cut into my narration was a breeze whistling into the room. It startled me, as I was certain I hadn't opened Robbie's bedroom window, not given the frosty weather. "Daddy!" Robbie cried, pointing at the open book resting on the duvet. "Book!" I closed the window and frowned a little as the chill remained, not from the air that had already slipped through the opening. No, this was a fresh breeze seeping into my home from somewhere else. "Daddy!" Robbie moaned impatiently as I walked back over. "I'm coming as quickly as my joints will allow," I groaned before sitting down beside him. When I picked up the book, I frowned. It was open on a different page, page 3, and the paperboard was damp. Seemed to be getting damper in my fingers, as if something were dripping onto it from a hidden place. "The bath must be running for the bump on his head," I read in a low whisper. "Robbie, this page is wet. Did you do this?" "Pika," Robbie replied, jabbing at the next line for me to continue. I sighed and nodded. "Pika 1, I said, before dropping the book onto the duvet. Then I placed a hand over my left eye as my son started to giggle. "Pika 2. When I covered the other eye with my free hand, plunging my vision into total darkness, I noticed that the room fell very still. Robbie fell very still. Then I croaked, "Pika 1-2, Boo!" I removed both hands to playfully spook my soon, but I was the one who screamed. Robbie was shivering and he started to bawl when I screamed. After all, my frightened reaction revealed what he'd already suspected, that something was not right with him. It wasn't the wetness that scared me, it was the redness. Robbie had been soaked from head to toe in reddish-brown water. It traveled along the carpet from his body to the open door. From the open door to the unlit bathroom across the landing. I picked him up, cradled him, and tried to stifle his sobs. Tried to stifle my own sobs. Then I noticed something else painted red. The page of the open book on the duvet below. One specific line of one specific page, to be exact, had been highlighted not with a teacher's red marker, but with blood. The bath must be running, I thought. Through Robbie's open doorway, I saw the upstairs banister, a barrier above the staircase below, and there followed two things from the steps. A creak and a shadow. More than a shadow. It was purest black, like the door frames pictured in the book. I felt something. There was only the one creak, but I felt something. Yes, it could have been the house's foundation settling. Could have been lots of things, but it wasn't. It was the steps. And yes, there was only one creak, but that was irrelevant. I knew something was walking up the steps. That was why I dashed to the bathroom with a red-stained Robbie in my arms. I flipped the light switch, shot to the tub, punched the plug into the drain, and twisted the hot tap to its fullest extent. I was hoping, admittedly, to see red water pour from the faucet, confirmation that I hadn't imagined any of it. But then, moving invisibly, the shower curtain drew to both the left and the right, fully shielding the bathtub from view. I stumbled backwards, pressing Robbie's face deeply in my chest so he didn't see. I didn't want to make his bawling worse by screaming, but heaven knows I nearly did. And anyone else would have screamed, or near enough screamed, having seen what I saw through the shower curtain. A silhouette against the fabric, a tub sitter with a large lump on the head. The figure leant forwards and dipped his head into the sloshing water. Then came slurping, vile, ear-scratching slurps that filled the small room. Someone sat in that tub and drank from it. And I noticed, as I watched, that the silhouette changed. That, as written in the book, the lump on the man's head started to flatten and shrink. Then, as suddenly as it started, came an end to the nightmare. With a thunk, the bathroom light turned off and all fell silent. But I felt him in the dark. Felt him come close to Robbie and me, so I darted towards the light switch and flipped it again. The light returned to reveal red, watery footprints across the bathroom floorboards, the landing and down the stairs. I accepted, at long last, that this wasn't sleep deprivation. I video called Carl, hysterical, showing him the red footprints throughout my house. He asked whether I'd spilt some wine, whether I'd been drinking again. We exchanged words and I hung. On Friday, I didn't go to work. I spent the day with Robbie and wore a brave face, but even toddlers know a lie. He saw it in my face and he was uncharacteristically quiet. I was simply thankful that his eyes were at least innocent once more. Thankful that we weren't reading that wretched book for once. Thankful that we seemed to be making it through the night without incident. Then, of course, around 7 in the evening came a knock on the front door. And I was ready to wail for mercy until Carl's voice came from the other side. "Josiah?" he called. I breathed a sigh of relief. "Look," Carl continued, "I'm sorry for the way our call ended last night. Mary's worried about you. I'm worried about you." I panted heavily. "Thanks, Carl, but Robbie and I just want a quiet night. I don't feel like talking tonight, I'm sorry." "Please, mate," he begged. "We've supported you for 2 years, but you're not well. We love you, and we loved Roberta too, so—" "Don't mention her," I whimpered. "I want what's best for you and Robbie," he said. "Please don't hide away. Not again. I'm scared. Do I need to call someone? Are you safe?" "I told you last night," I groaned. "We are not safe. There's something wrong with Mary's book. Robbie feels it too." "Robbie feels—" Carl started to repeat, then he scoffed exasperatedly. "Do you hear yourself, Josiah? You're not tired. You're drunk. If you keep this up, Robbie's going to lose his father too." "Leave," I snarled. He sniffled. "Number, you won't push me away." "I'm not drunk," I cried. "Just leave. Just—" "Okay," the man icily interrupted. I paused, pressing my ear against the wood to hear his quietening voice more clearly. "What?" "I said, okay," Carl repeated, feet clacking against stone as he stepped back. "You win, Josiah. I'll go." I frowned, but meekly answered, "Thank you." "Oh, and Josiah," my friend continued, "I wasn't entirely honest with you." "What?" I asked, throat almost too swollen to let the word out. "Well, you see, I do believe you," Carl whispered with a new voice, one with bottomless depth. "Pika 1, 2. The front door flung open, sending my body across the carpet, but I propped myself up on my elbows near immediately, some paternal reflex. I thought only of Robbie shuddering on the sofa beside his father's floored body, and then I screamed as I saw the blackness in the doorframe, just as I'd seen it on the stairs, in the book too. There was something in the void, and it wasn't Carl. The blackness started to collect, started to fold into itself, and a man emerged, standing against the world beyond, clear to my eyes once again. He who shows for supper. He looked like something, but my eyes won't tell me. Wouldn't pass that image to my brain, to my memory. It would have imploded my very soul. There are things unfit for the mortal gaze, and he was one of them. I scooped Robbie off the sofa and took flight. Flew upstairs 2 or 3 steps at a time, I'd wager. I'm not sure. My mind erased more than the thing that stood in the doorway. But I remember the sounds, those haunting sounds. Whistles beating against the house's outer walls, creaks of either the visitor following us up the stairs or synapses tearing in my mind, letting me float aimlessly in my mind so that I didn't have to remember any of it. But I remember clutching Robbie so tightly that I left bruises in his skin. That was how desperately I did not want him to see the face of he who shows for supper. I beelined to Robbie's room as his window sits above the awning. From there, we could climb to freedom. There were so many things I didn't think about, you see. The sounds surrounding the house, the sounds within the house. I opened the door to a wall of red, a gushing tide of red water, fully clean at last, that bluntly pummeled my son and me. Whatever happened next was another impossibility. Within a single moment, that wave of red had filled every room in the house from floors to ceilings, and I found myself swirling, son in my arms, underwater, entirely submerged. Maybe, in truth, it had taken minutes, hours. My brain had been bludgeoned into blackness. All I know is that I was gripping my boy feverishly, open eyes stinging against the red but unable to see through the thick color. Still, I guided myself by intuition and kicked forwards with rudder-like feet. I felt Robbie wriggle in my arms, so I knew he was alive. That kept me swimming through his underwater room. Lungs almost full to the top with filth, I finally found the wall. Then I found the window latch, and I managed to wrench it upwards. Once the window had swung outwards into the world, there followed a watery vortex, tugging at my body. I braced against the window frame as the house drained like a bathtub. The water level dropped below my head within seconds, and I lifted a spluttering Robbie above the surface. With forceful pats, I coaxed him into vomiting out the heavy redness, letting air back into his lungs. Then I clambered out of the window, clothes drenched and stained, but I didn't see he who shows for supper. I saw Carl and Mary standing on the front lawn, covered from head to toe in the red tidal wave that had just poured out of my house, had filled the lawn, seeped onto the road, and almost drowned the pair of them. 2 sodden, blood-soaked rats, and it was blood. We didn't need tests to prove that. I tasted it on my tongue. It just helped to think of it as red. I didn't fully accept the truth of what had happened until I saw the looks on Carl and Mary. They saw it all too. The blood. Felt it against their skin. But that was not all. As if woken from a deep sleep, Mary recalled something deeply buried. Her grandfather had once told her of a train journey that he took with his brother many years earlier, one that ended in his brother's disappearance. And in the pages of Pika 1-2 Boo, her grandfather told her that there lurked details which haunted him, things far too linked to his own life. "He said a man came for him," Mary whispered, still soaked in blood like the rest of us. "He who shows for supper, and Grandpa didn't remember him." "I don't either," I whispered. Mary shivered, sobbing. "I do. I'm so sorry for giving it to you, Josiah. He made me forget. What is he?" I asked hoarsely. My friend blubbered and shook her head ferociously. "Number, please. Don't make me describe him. He'll see me again. I don't want to see him again." Then Mary screamed at the wall, the blood-stained wall of my blood-stained lounge. There was nothing to see when Carl and I turned, but I knew something was there, much as something had been there in the blackness. And when we shot our heads back to Mary, Carl and I certainly saw something terrible. She was slashing blood from every surface imaginable directly into her eyes, screaming as she did so. "I don't see you!" Mary shrieked into the nothingness. "Go away!" An equally blood-stained Carl took his wife's shaking hands and sobbed alongside her. "Stop it! Stop! It's over now, Mary! Please stop!" I saw something in her blood-soaked eyes, not the shape of the man. That terror would have been smaller, easier to swallow. No, this was something familiar, a deep shade painted across Mary's pupils, and I'd seen it once before, on the face of the only other person who knew, the one who communicated to me with fear but not words, that he had seen and remembered the face of he who shows for supper. I'd seen those knowing eyes on Robbie. The Hanged Man. I've always been envious of other people's childhoods. The way they describe it, The country of the past was all golden sunlight and green fields and happy families and warm, safe blankets to curl up in. A longing sigh, the memory of starlight. I didn't have that. I don't remember much of my childhood. Only snatches of images here and there burnt around the edges. The twist of a long, bitter night, November wind whistling through the cracks in my bedroom window as I shivered under a pile of dirty laundry, the whispering ghosts of bruises on my upper arms, my lower back, my pudgy little legs, the teeth and the memory of laughter which was never, ever mine, the whine of mosquitoes and the squelch of mud as I weaved my way through the woods, sticking to the creek bottoms where no one ever came. It was safe there, among the sticker bushes, the tight green tunnels with room only for an escaping rabbit or a small-bodied girl hiding from the big bad world that wanted to eat her. Those are my happy memories. Among the biting insects and stinging nettles, I was safe. At least for a while. I remember the day I first found the hanged man. I don't remember what I was running from quite. It could have been anything. The world was full of things to run from in those days. But I broke out of the drainage ditch I'd been following for what felt like miles into a space I'd never seen before. I stopped, shocked. I'd thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but this place was new. I'd emerged into a tiny botanic cathedral, a dome of green vines split by golden pillars of light that filtered down through the canopy far above. A silver filigree of spider webs scrolled between brambles, ornamented with glorious gold and green garden spiders like jewels, bigger than any I'd ever seen before. I was familiar with spiders. I was friends with the ones who lived in the crawl space under my house. They listened to my whispers with silent sympathy, carrying on their incomprehensible arachnid missions in reassuring peace. I'd never found them threatening, but I'd never understood how beautiful they could be either, until I saw them in the diffuse, watery light of this new place. The floor of the chamber of vines was the bed of a stream, several drainage ditches flowing together. At this time of year, it was mostly dry, puddles of standing water swimming with larvae and water striders and crayfish, but with plenty of large, flat rocks to skip between so my sneakers didn't get even muddier. It was dim in here under the creepers, and I poked around the edges of the chamber first, in awe of the newts and jeweled beetles that skittered in the near darkness. Maybe that's why it took me so long on that first day to notice him. I don't know why I decided that the hanged man was a him, but the moment I saw it, it seemed obvious. At the very center of the dome of vines, high above my tiny head, hung a lump of wood, entangled in a nest of creepers. It didn't look at all like a man dangling upside down, but my child's mind painted the picture, and it was immediately permanent, undeniable, and irrevocably named. I had found the grotto of the hanged man. I stayed for hours that first day, until it was too dark to make out the print of the book I'd brought with me in my flight after school. As I wormed my way out through the tunnel, I thought would lead me most quickly to my house. I hoped I'd be able to find it again. I did. Nearly every day of that long, dark September, I squirmed through the mud back to my chamber of safety and stayed until the light above went out. The spiders thickened and then disappeared one by one, until by October the place was bejeweled only by the changing leaves, and I brought an old blanket full of holes to wrap up in. And the whole time I talked to him, to the hanged man, who ruled this place as surely as I came in supplication to it. The drainage ditch cathedral became my temple, my confessional. I would talk to the hanged man about my troubles at home, the children at school who pulled my tangled hair and laughed at my dirty clothes. And he would listen, I was convinced of it. Not like the spiders under the house, now mostly neglected except for the really bad nights, who didn't object when I talked to them as they wrapped up their prey but weren't really paying attention. No, the hanged man truly heard me. He stored my words up in the rotting wood of his heart, and I poured them into him like the lonely child that I was. The hanged man couldn't speak back, of course, but sometimes when the wind sighed cold through the brambles, I almost heard him. It was only 2 months, but when you're 7 years old, 2 months is so much of a lifetime that it seems endless. When you're 7 years old, 2 months is such a big slice of everything you've ever been that it might as well be the whole cake. 2 months is an eternity. When you're 7 years old, 2 months can be a lifetime. It was a lifetime with the hanged man before I thought to ask him for anything. I could consider regretting at this point the fact that I ever did, but I know it was inevitable. Those in need, no matter how battered, eventually figure out that it doesn't hurt as much to ask for help as it does to keep muddling on without it. Unless, of course, the wish is granted. And that teaches a different lesson entirely. I was bleeding that day. I remember that. I think it was a split lip and a burning scalp, though all these years later I can't be sure. There were many small wounds in those days, but this time I couldn't hold back the tears. This time I couldn't escape into a fairy tale. This time I had to make my own. So I cried, flat out. I told the hanged man what had happened. I sobbed, I nearly shrieked, and I begged him for help. "Save me," I must have said, or something like it. "Please help me. Please don't let this happen again." I didn't think to place limitations. I didn't think to ask the hanged man for some things, but not everything. Not absolutely anything he decided to do. And even now, if I could go back and change it all, I'm not sure whether I would. I fell asleep in the grotto that night, eyes aching, breath raw. I'm not sure when I awoke, but I know only blackness met my eyes when I opened them. No moonlight, no starlight. It was the darkness of a sinkhole, of the deep places under the earth where sunlight never comes. And before I turned, shaking, and felt my way along the black passage out to the real world I'd run from, I heard the chill wind whisper, from 1,000 directions in one voice, "Yes." I picked my way through the woods blind until the sun peeped above the horizon. I was utterly, utterly lost. And I don't remember much about the morning until I found a road and a man in a car found me, tattered blanket around my shoulders, all out of tears and words. He took me to a police station, and they took me to the smoking ruins of the house I'd lived in all my life. And all they found were bodies. Later, it was assumed I'd run from the flames and injured myself in my frantic flight. Later, it was assumed that a small child couldn't have caused the fire that started when the old, neglected stove shot a spark that ignited the tilting wooden house. Later, I mourned the poor spiders in the crawl space. That morning, as the sunlight filtered golden and watery through the windows of the police station, I knew only that the hanged man had listened to my plea. It did get better, though not much better. But when you're 7 years old and all you've known is pain, any little thing can be enormous, can be everything. I cried myself dry 100 times in my new, slightly improved home before I managed to escape and find my old familiar grotto again. It was spring by then and the water was higher. My new sneakers splashed in the cold, clear water of ice melt as I explored the room. I was slightly bigger, it was slightly smaller, but it was the same vegetable cathedral, twisted and brown with the quickening of the year, not flowing and green with the end of summer, but very much the same place. It was only that the hanged man had gone. A few vines swung from the roof, empty, but the hunk of wood that I'd poured my soul into was simply gone. I looked around the floor of the space, but I knew I wouldn't find him. The hanged man had answered me, and the hanged man had gone. I've grown a life since then. It's not a very good one. Maybe it never could have been. Maybe the curse placed on me when I was young was inescapable, no matter what happened. Maybe this is the best it ever could have been. Or maybe it could have been better. Maybe if I were older at the time, I could have phrased my wish more consciously. Maybe the hanged man could have granted me something else. Maybe I'd be a princess now in a castle. But I doubt it. After all these years, after all this education, I still believe that the hanged man was real. I still believe he heard me and did everything a lonely forest spirit could to save me. And maybe that was the only wish I'll ever get. I touch my scars sometimes. I trace the spaces where the bruises used to be with soft fingers, and I remember. And I'm grateful that I found that space, that dim place in the woods. And I wonder what happened to the hanged man. I wonder what he was, to grant the deepest wish of a lonely, battered child who had no one else to run to. I wonder whether, when I die, it will be in a forest, far away from anyone who will find the body. I wonder whether I'll petrify into something that looks from a distance like a lump of wood. I wonder whether I'll be hoisted into the air by creeper vines to dangle far above the head of a lonely child marinated in stories running from the world. And I wonder whether I'll disappear after granting the same wish. And I think there are far worse destinies. My family says we're cursed. I first learned about the curse when I was 12. While I was at my uncle's funeral, I heard the adults talking in hushed tones, whispering about who they thought the next one would be. Every time I asked them, they got quiet or made up excuses that they were talking about something else. When we got home, I asked my mom about what I'd heard. Her face went pale, but then she sighed. "I suppose you're old enough to know," she said. "Our family is cursed. No one knows exactly how or why it started, but whenever someone dies, 2 more will follow in the same calendar year. This includes people who married into the family. Do you remember when your grandpa died last month?" I nodded. My grandpa hadn't been terribly old, but he had died at the age of 67 due to heart failure. He refused to go to the hospital or visit any doctors, although we suspected he'd had several heart attacks throughout the years. Your grandpa was the first, and now your uncle, although it wasn't his time, was the second. My uncle married into my dad's side of the family. He never drank or did drugs, but he was always the life of any family gathering or party we had. One day he was driving home in the evening when there was a freak accident. The traffic light had malfunctioned and showed green on all sides. He'd been T-boned by another driver, and although the other driver walked away without a scratch, my uncle had died on the spot. "Who's going to be the third?" I asked. "We don't know. If the curse is merciful this time, it will take someone who's ready to go. There's no guarantee." I searched my mom's face for any sign she was joking, but she seemed completely serious. "Could I be the next one?" Her face softened. "Of course not. You're still a child. I've never seen the curse go after any children before. You'll be fine." I thought my mom was being dramatic and overthinking things. There was no such thing as a curse, and this one sounded ridiculous. As the year wore on, no one else died. Then, we got to December. My elderly aunt died at the ripe old age of 93 due to natural causes. There were more whispers and relief about her being the third, but I paid no mind to it. It was just a coincidence. Several years later, one of my older cousins died from complications of a chronic disease they'd had their entire life. The family started up their rumors again about who would be next. I paid it no mind because I still believed it was ridiculous. A few months later, an uncle I'd never met died from old age. The whispers of the curse continued to swirl. Then, my life turned upside down a few months later when my dad had a heart attack. He was only 43. He was rushed to the hospital and the doctors managed to save him, but said he would never be the same. He likely wouldn't live more than a few more years at best. They wanted to get him a heart transplant, but he refused. The couple in the room next to his were watching their loved one die because his body rejected the transplanted heart, and it was horrific. They told us if only they'd known this would happen, they gladly would have taken the few years he had left instead of watching him die like this. My dad said he would never take that chance and would rather enjoy the life his body had left to give him. Relatives filtered in and out, whispering about how he had cheated the curse and what would happen now. Would it find another victim? Would my dad still die that year somehow? Would it take 2 more victims as punishment? Nobody knew. Anytime they talked about the curse around me, I tried my best to shut it down. They were all acting like children with this curse nonsense. We almost got to the end of the year with nothing else happening. Then, towards the end of December, my great-aunt slipped on a patch of black ice while coming out of church. She broke her neck and died instantly. The other relatives seemed relieved that there was a third, and my dad hadn't somehow cheated the curse and made it worse. My brother was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder that same year, and some whispered how that must have been my dad's punishment for surviving. I didn't understand how the adults could be so cruel to say things like that, especially to my brother. My dad made it 10 more years before he couldn't hold on anymore and his body gave out. A month later, his mother, my grandmother, had a stroke and died as well. It wasn't entirely unexpected. She'd had several strokes over the years, and the pain of losing my dad, her youngest child, must have been bad. I graduated college and moved across the country a few months after, along with my brother and my mom. I was fed up with the relatives and all their nonsense. Beyond just the curse business, they liked to stir up drama. We decided we would leave my dad's side of the family and their curse behind and cut contact with most of them. My brother and I didn't want any of our potential future kids to experience any of what we had to go through. Although I had to admit, I was starting to wonder about the curse. Was it really just a coincidence that people in our family kept dying in threes? Later that year, I heard from one of my cousins I kept in touch with that her dad was diagnosed with a rare aggressive form of cancer. They treated it as aggressively as possible since he was so young, but he died only a month after they got the news. Like me, she was also ticked off about the relatives saying it was because of the curse, and she also cut contact with them. About 10 years passed with no drama. I really thought we'd left all that behind. My brother got married and had 2 kids, and I'm still looking for the right person. I got a job as a nurse, and I live across town from my brother and help him manage his autoimmune condition and sometimes watch the kids. I love being an aunt and can't wait to start my own family someday. A few months ago, we had a bit of a tragedy on my mom's side of the family. Her mom, my grandma, had been declining in health over the last 8 years and was in a nursing home for the last year before she finally passed away. My mom's younger brother took this really hard. He had a ton of health conditions he was born with, and he had already outlived the life expectancy given to him by the doctors. It wasn't a shock when he passed a few months after, but it was very sad. "I'm going to move in with my dad for a while," my mom had told me. "I don't want the shock of losing his wife and only son to kill him. I don't want him to be the third." "Are you really still on about that curse?" I asked. "It wasn't even from your side of the family. It was from Dad's." "No, you're right. There's no curse," she acquiesced. "But that doesn't mean the shock couldn't still kill your grandpa. I don't want to lose both my parents and my brother in the same year." My mom went back to live with him. This left me, my brother, and his family alone over here. A few months later, in November, his kids both got sick with something nasty and passed it to my brother and his wife. I'll admit, although I didn't believe in the curse, I was a little on edge because of it. Since he had an autoimmune disorder, he had to be on medications to stop his immune system from working properly so it didn't continue to attack his body. This meant that his weakened immune system wasn't strong enough to fight off a lot of common illnesses, so he needed a lot of rest and medications to help fight even a simple cold. I know my body is strong enough to fight off whatever germs his kids have, so I've been going over there every day after work to help so he can rest. Since I'm a nurse, I've been exposed to enough illnesses that I'm immune to most germs anyway. It's been a week and they're all recovering well, even my brother. I think I'm starting to get sick, though. It came on pretty fast. I was fine this morning, but now that I'm going to bed, I spiked a fever of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. I've also got terrible muscle aches and chills. My throat is killing me, and my face and chest turned bright red. I was totally fine a few hours ago. I probably just need to sleep it off. I'll take some Tylenol to help with the fever and pain, and I'm sure I'll feel much better when I wake up. I'm only 29, so I'm strong enough to fight this off. My new patient is a televangelist, and he's an absolute monster. In 1978, a late-night television broadcast of unknown origin aired on a public access channel serving the state of Missouri. No records of the broadcast exist. Witness testimony is all that remains. The only concrete details regarding the broadcast include the following. The show aired at 11:45 p.m. on a Wednesday evening in October. The name of the show was More Than God Is Here. The host was a man called Reverend Moore. The content of the broadcast is less easy to determine. Different witnesses offered different descriptions. One viewer claimed the show contained a vision of heaven itself. Another insisted it was a standard televangelist grift. Several more said the host spoke directly to them, addressing them by name through the screen, offering words of comfort and promises of a prosperous future, just so long as they followed him. A dozen viewers the content was a rousing sermon that galvanized and renewed their faith. Others reported to have seen a man peeling his face off and leering into the camera. One witness went so far as to claim that the show host reached out of the television set with hideous dead hands and told her the end of the world was coming, but that he would save her if she would just take his hand. As previously noted, no record of the broadcast exists. However, records of the response to the show are extant. Letters of complaint, praise, and question remain on file, maintained to this day by the owner of the now-defunct station. With the owner's permission, the agency made copies of all correspondence related to the broadcast. These copies remain with the agency and are available to review on request. Please note that the Agency of Helping Hands has determined that the owner knows nothing of Not God Moore and simply keeps the correspondence due to the local folklore factor. More Than God Is Here continued to air Wednesday nights at 11:45 p.m. Interestingly, the longer the show aired, the more cohesive viewers' memories became. By the 8th episode, the recollections of witnesses are similar enough that the agency is confident each individual saw, or at least perceived, the same broadcast. Why there were such disparities in recollections in the first place is still not known. Detailed accounts and abridged summaries of the episodes are available upon request. Under the circumstances, it is important to note that the otherwise lacking illusion of Not God Moore's humanity appears flawless on camera. For reasons the agency has been unable to determine, any and every part of him appears perfectly human when photographed, videoed, or even simply viewed through a camera lens. This phenomenon undoubtedly allowed him to cultivate his popularity. The show continued to air for a year. The one-year anniversary episode of More Than God Is Here ended with the host, Reverend Moore, inviting his viewers to meet him in the flesh next Wednesday at 11:45 p.m. at a local lake. Despite the strangeness of the day, hour, and the request itself, it is estimated that approximately 70 people turned up to meet Reverend Moore. Witness accounts are difficult to digest, each seemingly more fantastical and horrifying than the last. The one component on which all accounts agree is that this was an evening of miracles both great and terrible, an evening so profoundly spectacular that ended with an awestruck attendee asking the question that was on everyone's mind by that point. "Are you God?" To which the Reverend responded, "I'm not God. I'm more." What followed his pronouncement led to the creation of an off-grid cult dedicated to this copper-eyed miracle worker of unknown origin. A miracle worker and a god he may have been, but generous he was not. According to even his most devoted follower, Not God was a demanding lord. In exchange for his miracles and favor, followers were required to surrender their money, belongings, dwellings, even their loved ones if Not God asked. Those who did were rewarded beyond comprehension, or so it is claimed. To date, no witnesses have been able to provide concrete details regarding these rewards, and no evidence of any reward bestowed by Not God Moore is known to exist. Those who did not give what they were instructed to surrender were eaten. Not God Moore's diet was limited indeed. He drank lake water and cannibalized his less cooperative followers, who were butchered according to a specific ritual that involved all members of his cult. The ritual ended with Not God Moore eating the brain and heart of the victim, then requiring his followers to consume the rest of the carcass. The agency possesses a full recording of one such ritual. Access is subject to clearance and permission from both Dr. Hyde and the requester's chain of command. Not God Moore came to the agency's attention when a teenage escapee from the cult reported him to local police. The report was dismissed. As a minor, the witness was remanded to state custody. Due to the horrors he had witnessed, the youth was not able to achieve mental stability and as a result was eventually incarcerated at a secure inpatient facility. From there, his story wound its way through the institution and eventually reached a Varangian agent whose prompt attention to the matter led the agency to the compound of Not God Moore. The details of the scene remain classified to this day, and as of this writing, there are no plans to declassify them. Suffice to say, the condition of Not God Moore's cult was so dire, and the threat posed by setting them free so uniquely critical that, for the first and only time in agency history, administration issued an order to terminate each and every human being on site. Agency personnel attempted to terminate Not God Moore alongside his followers, but were unsuccessful. Fortunately, they were able to capture and transport him to the North American Pantheon, where he remains to this day. Not God Moore has alternately described himself as Not God, the worm in the heart of the world, your destroyer, their creator, and the Nemesis Star. He has not elaborated on any of these descriptors. However, it should be noted that Dr. Wingeride has made a measurable amount of progress with him over the years. To summarize, Not God Moore is the chosen name of an entity that located, collected, and to an extent farmed his victims by employing the novel strategy of masquerading as a prosperity gospel televangelist. As is the case with several inmates in our care, the agency has no idea what Not God Moore actually is, where he came from, the true extent of his capabilities, or his motivations. Here is what the Agency of Helping Hands does know. Upon casual inspection, Not God Moore appears to be a middle-aged man of generally nondescript appearance, with dark hair, a practiced smile, and notably bright eyes. He is partial to dark suits, shiny brown shoes, and a lightly feathered haircut that somewhat, if not perfectly, recalls styles that were popular in the United States in the 1970s. However, the normalcy of his appearance is entirely illusory. The longer and more closely one looks, the thinner the illusion becomes. Not God Moore loves to speak. He is extremely charismatic and can easily mesmerize individuals as well as crowds, sometimes instantaneously. For this reason, all personnel assigned to Not God Moore are issued with specialized ear protection and eyewear. Immediate distraction of his targets is necessary because Not God Moore is always smiling, and his teeth are the first major indicator that he is not human. He has front-facing masking teeth that look like standard adult teeth. However, behind the masking teeth on both the upper and lower jaws are a set of short, small, excessively sharp teeth that curve back toward his throat. His eyes are the second indicator. Not God Moore's eyes appear bright brown at first glance, and appear so at all times to subjects under his influence. In reality, however, they are a highly unusual copper hue with mild reflective properties. While humanity is a difficult quality to quantify, it cannot be argued that this quality is missing from Not God Moore's eyes, which are very bright, very flat, and constantly moving. The skin of his face is the third indicator. While healthy-looking and natural for a man of the age he is projecting, Not God Moore's flesh veers into the uncanny valley in two areas. At the corners of the mouth, where observers note a peculiar pinned appearance, and around the eyes, where it is unnaturally loose in a way that recalls, as one agent described it, a starched shirt that's way too big. The fourth indicator is the appearance of his hands. While the skin visible elsewhere on Not God Moore's body is a normal, healthy color, his hands are discolored. The tops are a uniform middling gray hue with a greenish aspect, while the bottoms are swollen and dark purple, that is, livid. In other words, Not God Moore has the hands of a corpse. Despite the myriad dangers and difficulties posed by Not God Moore, Agency Command is tentatively hopeful that Dr. Wengeride's collaboration with the organization's newly commissioned T-Class agent will produce new and important insights into the entity's origins, abilities, and motivations, and hopefully provide information that can eventually be used to terminate him. That Not God Moore must be terminated is not up for debate. However, other aspects of his case remain up for debate. Those questions must be answered prior to his termination. As an agnosto-class inmate with a highly localized impact radius and a bizarrely specific modus operandi, the acuity of the threat Not God Moore poses remains uncertain. The agency knows that the inmate poses critical danger on a small scale, but does not know whether that scale represents the extent of his capabilities or whether it is, for lack of a better term, merely a taster. Dr. Wengeride is of the opinion that the truth is closer to the latter than the former. Command agrees as of this writing and has issued the official opinion that Not God Moore's actions with his cult were essentially an opening salvo, perhaps even a game. In the best-case scenario, the actions taken by the entity were nothing but a minor distraction, the equivalent of a mean-spirited child using a magnifying glass to burn ants on a slow summer afternoon. Unfortunately, the agency must always prepare for the worst-case scenario rather than the best. For Not God Moore, the worst-case scenario is that he was merely practicing for a much larger and more significant conquest. Unfortunately, the answer to the question of his underlying motivation remains unanswered. It is the agency's hope that this answer, as well as many others, will find resolution during the inmate's scheduled interview with the agency's new T-Class interviewer. Whatever his motivation and whatever his origin, Not God Moore's considerable power of influence over large numbers of human beings makes him critically dangerous for many reasons. It is therefore imperative that he remains constantly monitored and heavily guarded until the moment it is safe to terminate him. Due to the critical threat posed by this entity, Dr. Charles Wengeride was originally scheduled to attend the examination alongside the interviewer. However, as Dr. Wengeride is currently indisposed pending the outcome of his recent disciplinary review, the interviewer was instead accompanied by Commander Raphael Wengeride and his T-Class partner, Christoph Wolf. It should be noted that their attendance occurred over the interviewer's strenuous objections. I'll never stop locking the door. My boyfriend and his roommates don't understand the privilege of not having to lock their door. When I come to visit, it's like they experience culture shock when they try to barge in and they find it's locked. None of them even carry keys. I once accidentally locked one of his roommates out for the night and he had to walk to a friend's and sleep there. They never got mad at me for it. They all understood why it was a habit I wasn't willing to break. My boyfriend and I were long distance. Since I worked from home and he and his roommates were out of the house for the majority of the day, I would come and stay for a week at a time. They all worked Saturdays, but I had weekends off, so I was laying in my boyfriend's bed, in the room closest to the front door, having locked it and snuggled back in to relax until I felt like getting ready for the day. The apartment complex they lived in comprised of buildings that connected, but had separate staircases and entrances pertaining to that section of apartments. My boyfriend's apartment was all the way at the top left of the last building, nearest to the woods. It was in a nice neighborhood in the suburbs of two busy metropolitan areas. The front doors of the buildings were never locked. The residents didn't even pretend that they locked. They would even leave them propped open with large rocks for most of the day and night. On the occasions the door wasn't propped open, when someone came into the building, it would slam loudly before bouncing back to an ajar position. My boyfriend always told me to never answer the door, especially if I was alone. On this morning, about an hour after the guys had left, I was reading a Tumblr post on my phone when I heard the door slam, and what I swore was a cry for help. I sat upright in bed and listened again, sure that I had gotten it wrong. I was prone to anxiety, diagnosed OCD, and knew I could let my thoughts twist and turn into the worst-case scenarios that frequently went beyond realistic. As I listened, there were no more cries, but it sounded as though someone was laboriously attempting to climb the stairs. There were 2 flights between the entrance and my boyfriend's front door. As the sounds of fumbling footsteps, high-pitched panting and grunting, and palms on concrete neared the door, I heard another cry for help, and I knew for certain I heard it this time. Instead of concern, my blood ran thick with fear at the sound. Something about it seemed off. Wrong. I quietly crept out of bed and neared closer to his bedroom door. I heard the woman clamber to the top of the steps and cry for help again. Instead of going for my boyfriend's front door directly to her left, I heard the woman start pounding on the door of the person across the landing. Guiltily, I felt relieved. There were only 2 doors between my boyfriend's and the person across from him. After having tried the 2 in the middle, the woman finally came pounding on the front door. I gasped and jumped, and my hands flew up to cover my mouth. I pushed my boyfriend's, thankfully silent, bedroom door open and peered into the hallway. I weighed the risk of checking the peephole, for I knew if she noticed a shadow, she'd know I was in there ignoring her. Also, I was scared of what I would find on the other side of the door. To my further shock and horror, the door handle started to jiggle as well. The pounding was frantic and louder and longer than she had done on the other neighbors' doors. I gathered all my courage and took careful footsteps toward the entryway. I tried my best to make no noise, even though I doubt she'd hear me over her violent knocks. Once I was close enough that I was confident I could check the peephole, whilst also not casting a shadow under the door, I leaned forward and squinted into the tiny glass circle. My mouth went dry and I had to suppress a scream-turned cough. Standing unnecessarily close to the peephole was a man. A grown, disheveled beard, cracked lips, runny nose, crazy-eyed man. I cursed myself for leaving my phone in the bed when all of a sudden the noise stopped. I was paralyzed in my spot. I waited to hear him give up and walk away, but he never did. I wanted to sprint and grab my phone to call 911, but was scared he would break down the door if he heard me. With nothing else to do, my morbid curiosity and flight instinct propelled me to look back into the peephole. He was just standing there, breathing heavily at a high pitch with a wide, delirious smile on his face. Some of his lips started bleeding from a crack being split open again. He barely had any teeth, and the ones he did have were either completely black or a combination of brown and dark green. He took a large inhale through his nose and his eyes rolled in his head. "Why won't you help me?" He cried out in that near-perfect impression of a woman's voice. It took every ounce of my self-control and patience to let me go back to my boyfriend's room at a pace that didn't expose me. Once inside, I hurried across the carpet to sift through the sheets and blankets for my phone. Once I had it in my hands, I immediately moved to call 911, but a different idea popped into my head last minute. With swift fingertips, I searched "man angry someone at door" audio. I turned down my volume so only I could hear, and quickly sifted through my options. Having chosen one I hoped would work, I went back and held my phone through the doorway and into the hall, volume on full blast. Who the hell is pounding down my door at this hour? They must be crazy. You know what? Let me grab my gun so we can both say good morning. There was the sound of a gun clicking at the end of the track, and that was the one thing that finally made the man flee down the steps. I heard the door slam as he left the building. Shaking, I went back and checked the peephole to confirm he was actually gone. I considered still making a call to the police, but knew I wouldn't have much else besides my story. I decided to head into the kitchen and dining area to grab a bottle of water and take a seat. On the way, I passed the small balcony that was rarely ever used. Suddenly filled with fear again, I ran over and moved back the curtain to find nothing. I finally let out a sigh of relief when I remembered the apartment wasn't on the first floor. Still, I reached up my fingers and turned the lock.